Hello and welcome to my podcast. I'm Ambassador Eli Vered Chazan, and welcome to my guest, Bilhari Kausikan.
Hi, Ambassador. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm very happy to have you here. Let me just introduce you. Bilhari is a former ambassador at large in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore between 2001 and May 2013. He was first and second permanent secretary and then permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. During his career, he has served in a variety of appointments, including as Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York and as ambassador to the Russian Federation. He studied at Raffles Institution, the University of Singapore, and Columbia University in New York. Today, he is the chairman, Middle East Institute, National University of Singapore. He has published few books who are bestsellers. The last one is Singapore is Still Not an Island. Bilhari, again, thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks for inviting me, Ambassador.
So let's start immediately. We are before 2024. I mean, we are right now at the end of November 2023. And as we have witnessed, the last year was a very complicated year when it comes to geopolitical issues. And I wanted to start, the first question, in fact, is that in 1989, Francis Fukuyama's famous article on the end of history was published, an article he later wrote into a book in 1992. Many of those who read Fukuyama's thought that the era of wars was over and that liberal Western democracies would become dominant. I guess you remember that in 1996, Fukuyama's teacher, Professor Samuel Huntington, published the book, The Clash of Civilizations. Bilhari, we stand almost 3 decades since then, and we see that the world has changed a lot geopolitically. John Mearsheimer claims that since the fall of the Iron Curtain, up till 2017, the USA was a single superpower. He calls it unipolar moment. Now we are witnessing, that's what he says, a new situation. We are currently in a multipolar world. Russia and China have joined the Americans as superpowers. How do you foresee things when it comes to it?
Well, first of all, I always thought that Fukuyama's thesis was delusionary.
Okay.
He's a rather intelligent man, but it was a very stupid thesis, in fact, bordering on delusionary. Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations was a little bit more grounded in reality, but it was a deep oversimplification. For example, you see within the Sinic civilization, the Confucian civilization, you see very complicated relations between Japan and China, between both Koreas, North and South and China, and between Korea and Japan, right? So I think civilization is too broad a category to be really very meaningful. I would always look rather at interests rather than these broad abstractions. Now, there was a unipolar moment. It was a very short one. John Mearsheimer, I think, says it lasted from the end of the Cold War, say 1989 to 2017. Yeah. I would actually put it, I think it ended much earlier, maybe 2008, when the global financial crisis broke out.
Okay, yeah.
When the global financial crisis broke out, it caused widespread disillusion, including among many Americans, by the way, with American-led globalization. But even at that period, it was only the overwhelming dominance of American power that gave the illusion of unipolarity. China, I don't think, ever quite shared the American view of the world. Neither did India, I don't think. It shared some parts, but not all parts. China shared some parts, but not all parts. Russia, ditto. You can say the same of any power, big and small. I think it is of any international order as necessarily uncontested or even peaceful. For example, the so-called unipolar moment, whether you date it until 2017 or you date it as I do until 2018, 2008,
2008,
sorry,
yeah.
Was not free of conflict. Was not free of conflict in the world. It was just not conflicts that necessarily involve other major powers. In fact, for 40 years after the end of the Second World War, the international order was defined by the contestation between the former Soviet Union and the US. That have to be accepted. In fact, more often than not, it is the contest that defines the order. That short unipolar moment was unique. It was unique because China was not yet on an economic trajectory to take off. It had just recovering, it was still recovering in the initial stages from Tiananmen. Russia was in a terribly incoherent state, post-Soviet Russia, I mean.
Yeah.
Even India was still much more inward-looking, and you could say that of any major power. Secondly, I think it's wrong to think of any order as static, not just uncontested, but static. The idea of multipolarity is, I think, a dynamic one. It is a multifaceted one. I think it is, in contemporary international relations, we cannot just think of the traditional indexes of state power, military power, GDP, and so on, right?
Yeah.
Level of industrialization. I think we have to look at different kinds of power in different domains. Okay, I give you one example involving Singapore. I think it's completely ridiculous to think of Singapore as a kind of pole in any multipolar world, as it is traditionally conceived, right? Because we are a tiny country, we are a city-state, right? In fact, from that point of view, it's also less silly, but still not quite completely realistic to think of Israel, because it's also a small country, right?
Yeah, of course.
But in certain domains, Singapore, as a logistics center, we are quite a big pole in the question, in the issue of high-tech. I set aside military in this. The issue of high-tech. Israel is a power, right? Globally, not just
of course.
So the idea of power and therefore the idea of multipolarity has become desegregated, and we have to think of it in that way. I'm not a great fan, as you know, of international relations theory, and all the gentlemen you mentioned, Mearsheimer, Huntington, they are international relations theorists. I studied international relations theory and then I practiced it. I practiced international relations for 37 years. And my conclusion, maybe a rather sad conclusion, is that if there was any resemblance between what I had studied and what I did for a living, it's purely coincidental. It's too simple. So I think we are living in an era of multipolarity. In fact, we have never stopped living in an era. The world is diverse. Some powers have always been more important than other powers. But that's the normal state of affairs. Contestation is a normal state of affairs. Right? To be honest, I always thought that peace is something to be explained. It's not a normal state of affairs.
Okay.
Stability is something to be explained and to be created. It's not a normal state of affairs in international relations.
Yeah. I understand. Okay. Another interesting question related to your work. You recently focused your lecture in Switzerland, I believe so, on how the question of whether the 21st century will be the Asian century is an accurate view. To many in Europe and the US, in the Western world, for me as Israeli as well, they do view that this century belongs to Asia when it comes to economy, deterrence, and things like that. Why do you disagree with this assessment?
Well, I disagree with the rather simplistic characterization of any era by some geographic adjective. Huh?
Yeah.
For example, it's also said the 20th century was American century, right? But actually, as we have just talked about, first of all, the first half of the 20th century was largely European, not American, not the same thing.
People would say until 1914, but nevertheless.
No, okay, I say even 1914. 1917, the Americans intervened and made a great difference in World War I. But after that, the Americans were not interested in the world. So the Europeans had a reprieve of some decades.
Yeah.
Right? But even when after the Second World War, as we have discussed, it was not just an American century. It was a century that was contested between America and its friends and the Soviet Union and its friends. So I think even at that time, it was a bit too simple. And now, Asian century. Okay, certainly 21st century is not going to be a totally Western century, however you define the West, right? Yeah. Because new powers which are non-Western have arisen. China, Japan much earlier, but India, Brazil.
We will speak about BRICS later.
Okay, we can speak about the BRICS later, but look at most of the tension points in Asia. Asia is too broad an abstraction. It's too broad a category, to my mind, to have any coherent political or strategic meaning. There are serious problems within China and India. There are serious problems within within China and Japan, between Japan and Korea, between China and Korea, both North and South. And you can think of many other combinations, even just in Southeast Asia. In other words, if you think that Asian century requires some coherence of Asia, it doesn't exist. To say that certain Asian countries, China among them, have become economic and strategic powers in their own right is a different matter from saying this is an Asian century. Because Europe is still a major economic power, if not political or strategic. The US is still a major political and strategic and economic power. Yeah. And of course, you have India, you have China, you have Japan, you have South Korea, and so on. Yeah. What you can say, and why did countries like Japan, China, India all become economic powers? There is no such thing as a traditional power anywhere in the world. Traditional powers are backward powers. All these countries, starting with Japan in the 19th century, became powers because they adapted very well to a Western-defined modernity. They adapted the techniques and ideas of the West to their own local conditions and therefore risk. And that's true of tiny countries like Singapore, as well as huge countries like China or India, right?
Obviously.
It's not a Western-defined world anymore, but the frameworks are still Western. There was no idea of modernity before the West. I mean, you only had a choice. If you were trying to develop yourself in the 19th century or the 20th century, you only had a choice. You adapt from the Western, the American European model, based basically on the market and based basically on the rights of the individual, liberal democracy, or you adapt from the Soviet Russian model, right? Which is based on a planned economy, based on vanguard, the subordination of the individual to the party, right? Yeah. There's no other choice because these were the only industrialized societies. Now, I keep reminding my Chinese friends, that Marx, Engels, and Lenin are not ancient Chinese sages. Huh? So
you're right.
So you are also Westernized, right?
Yeah.
In a different way.
I understand.
It's too simple. I mean, it's too simple. It's a nice metaphor, but it's too simplistic a metaphor to really explain anything.
I understand. Okay, very interesting. Let's move to the next question. Neil Ferguson, the historian, claims that we are in a second Cold War. apparently, when you look at the events happening around the globe, the rules that are now being written and a new reality that we are walking into, it seems that he's right. What do you think? Are we witnessing a second Cold War?
No, I think he's fundamentally wrong. And as a historian, he ought to know better.
Okay.
Right? First of all, what was the Cold War? The Cold War between the US and the former Soviet Union and their allies. Both of them led two fundamentally different systems. I just mentioned it just now. One based on the market and the rights of the individual and liberal democracy. One based on planned economy and the Supreme Party. Right? The Leninist Party. And their struggle was between these two systems to see which is the better way of organizing modern industrial society. And we know what happened, right?
Yeah.
The collapse of the Soviet Union.
The West has won a decisive victory.
5 Leninist parties left. China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. All of them, none of them actually are pure communist systems in at least half the definition of what communist systems. Now, China is the primary example. Vietnam is another one. They are mixed economies. They they rely totally on state planning anymore, as did the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Right? They are still led by a big change already. Secondly, all of us, there's competition, there's fierce competition between the US and China, for example. But they are both competing within a single system. They are both part of a single global system. They are not leading two separate systems.
Okay.
There are differences between the systems, but they are both part of a single global world economic system. And economics and politics cannot be very neatly separated, to my mind. So they are competing not between systems, but within systems.
Therefore,
yes, there are some superficial similarities. Yeah, so it's fundamentally different from the Cold War. There are some superficial similarities, right? Superficial, but not essential similarities. Secondly, I think, people are trying to change the rules. You know, the struggle within a system, which is different from between systems, is also about struggle about who defines rules, right? That's true. Yeah. But it's a less existential struggle. China is not trying to completely replace the whole global economic system with his own system, because the system is based on the
Bilari, there are some people who would doubt you, but okay.
I know they doubt me because they make too much of a distinction between democracy and authoritarianism.
Okay.
Basically that. But even let us say China, I don't think China is trying to replace the whole set of rules. China is not happy with every rule. And why should they be? Because they didn't define the rules.
Okay.
But are they trying to change anything fundamental? I don't see China trying to change anything fundamental. I think to describe contemporary international relations, as some people do, mainly in Europe and North America, as a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, is too simple, because there are many types of democracy and there are many types of authoritarianism. And Western democracy does not arouse unqualified admiration from everybody, including myself, and not all forms of authoritarianism arouse abhorrence from everybody, including myself, right?
Yeah.
It's too simple. So it's a much more complicated competition to be described as a new Cold War. I think as a historian and as an economic historian, Neil Ferguson should know better. The rules, look, we all talk about rules-based order, right? Well, it's a new buzzword. But do we mean the same thing by rules-based order? For example, many countries in Asia, including myself, place much more emphasis on the economic rules rather than the political rules.
Yeah.
And insofar as we place emphasis on the political rules, we place emphasis on rules governing relations between states. For example, respect for territorial integrity, respect for sovereignty, and so on, rather than rules that some Western countries have interpreted as allowing interference in the internal affairs of states.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? So, rules-based order is a broad term that can mean different things. People place different interpretations on different rules. People place different emphasis on different rules. And it's not just China. I think even many countries are not entirely happy with every rule because they had no say in making those rules. Now, where China goes wrong is, and I keep telling my Chinese friends, there are rules about changing rules. If you're not happy with these rules, there are rules about how to change these rules. You cannot unilaterally try to change the rules as you're trying to do in the South China Sea, in the Himalayas, or in the East China Sea. That's where they go wrong, right? But the fact that they are not happy with every rule, well, Singapore is not happy with every rule. I don't think Israel is happy with every rule. Right?
No, not at all.
But, definitely, particularly at this time, when the war in Gaza is being fought partly over what kinds of rules should be applied and under what circumstances, right?
Yeah.
And there's a bit of standards there.
Yeah.
As you know, better than me.
Yeah, of course.
Right? I mean, I don't want to talk too much about the Gaza war, but look, let's not forget how it started. Huh?
Of course.
Okay, with a horrific terrorist attack on 7th October. What rules was that? What rules did that comply with?
Exactly.
Okay. Right?
Yeah.
So let's not forget all these things. But so there are rules and there are rules. And look, let us be very frank. You are now a diplomat, but I've been a diplomat all my life. You ask any diplomat from any country, there is no country that can pursue a completely consistent foreign policy. It is just not possible because the world is complicated and principles are simple.
Yeah.
That's why they are principles. A complicated principle is not a principle, right?
Yeah.
So the only way to be completely consistent, and that's true of Singapore, of Israel, of US, of China, of European countries, anyone you mean, any country. The only way to be completely consistent is not to have a foreign policy, to do nothing. Then you can be consistent. That gets you into all kinds of other trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. We are running out of time, so let me proceed to the next question. You served as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations. How do you see the status of organizations like the BRICS, for example, and others? I mean, it's a very interesting phenomenon.
I think you use the right word, phenomenon, right? I think BRICS, to my mind, represents a mood. It's not an organization. It represents a mood, just like the non-aligned movement represents a mood, just like the G77 represents a mood. Now, a mood, what kind of mood? The mood is that I'm not completely happy with all the Western rules. But a mood are not interests. You look at the BRICS as the expanded BRICS, right? There are serious problems between China and India.
Yeah.
There are serious problems between Egypt, a new member, and Ethiopia over the Nile.
Yeah.
There are serious problems between the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Iran, new member. So a mood is not a definition of interest. It's a slogan by a fund manager and not a geopolitical concept. It has very little geopolitical coherence except as representation of that mood. I don't think it will amount to very much.
I understand.
Okay, give you a thing, right?
Yeah.
Israel has excellent relations with India.
Yeah.
It has correct relations with Egypt, UAE, and I think one day you will have good relations with Saudi Arabia or correct relations with Saudi Arabia. But you have bad relations with Iran, and I don't see that changing. So what does Egypt, India have in common vis-a-vis just Israel? Just one small slice of the world, right? With the rest of the BRICS. Nothing very much.
Yeah. I understand. Final last question. Last week, the cover of The Economist was done in black when Trump's figures was drawn, and the title was The World Ahead 2024. Are we witnessing a gloomy future if Trump is indeed elected? How do you see it?
I think we'll face a more complicated future, but not all regions will face the same complications. Okay. I don't think American policy towards Asia or the Middle East will change that much. But it may change a lot in Europe, right? But look, I think there is only one America. There's only one America. And one thing that the wars in Ukraine and the war in Gaza have proved is how indispensable America is to maintaining regional balance. Yeah. You remember Iran was looking very threateningly against Israel at the beginning of the war. Yeah. Suddenly, America deploys 2 aircraft carrier and cruise missile armed submarine, and Iran calms down and sends word to America, I don't want this thing to be a bigger war. You can see the same in Ukraine, right? Europe is incapable of dealing with Russia without America. NATO, right? So America is NATO itself, indispensable. So whether it is Trump or Biden or Mr. X, we have to deal with America. There is no choice. It may be less complicated, it may be more complicated, but there is no choice. We have to be pragmatic about this.
I understand. Bilhari, thank you very much. Let me assume that was the first segment. It was revealing. Have a great day and see you soon in another program.
See you soon.